At 16, I faced a betrayal that turned my youth upside down. My stepfather, without bothering to soften the blow, pointed me to the door bluntly. His words, delivered with chilling indifference, seared themselves into my memory. "You're no kin of mine, and your problems are not my concern." These words, like an icy dagger, pierced me, stripping away any remaining sense of security and leaving me with a suffocating emptiness. I, Ethan Ward, was just a scrawny teenager at that moment, burdened only by a meager backpack and a complete lack of life prospects. For years, I had tried in vain to earn the favor of Colton Brigg, the man who had married my mother. Stern and uncompromising, he never once called me son, seeing me only as a living reminder of another man he was determined to erase from our family history. On that fateful night, my mother, Mara, stood behind him, clutching the edge of her sweater. Tears blurred her eyes, but she didn't resist his decision. Her voice trembled as she whispered words of regret. "I'm sorry, Ethan. Please forgive me." I yearned for her protection, but I also saw the fear frozen in her gaze. Years of living in Colton's shadow had turned her into a prisoner, stripped of her will. I remember leaving the house and stepping into the impenetrable darkness, carrying only a bag and a small silver locket my mother had given me as a child. This locket seemed to be my only connection to my real father, the last shard of a fading past. The door slammed shut behind me with a dull thud, announcing the loss of my home. At 16, I found myself in an icy void, realizing I had been betrayed by the only family I had ever known. From that night on, my life on the streets began. I scrounged for food, slept under bridges, and begged passers-by for spare change just to survive. Night after night, the same question tormented me. Why had my biological father abandoned me? This bitterness became my constant companion. Yet life, as they say, is full of unexpected turns. 14 years later, at the age of 30, working as a dishwasher in a dingy diner, I met a man who changed my destiny. Silas Crane, as he introduced himself, declared at the outset, "I've been looking for you for 14 years. In his hands was an envelope containing the truth about my origins, a truth that shattered my perceptions of myself and the reasons for my solitude. Inside the envelope was a bank statement showing $73 million in my account and a letter from my biological father explaining why I had to be hidden. That night, when Colton Brigg kicked me out, I thought my life had collapsed. I couldn't have imagined it was just the beginning. Before that ill-fated night when Colton showed me the door, my life already felt like a house of cards. I was born in a small town in Ohio, and as far back as I could remember, it was just my mother, Mara, and me. She was a quiet, gentle woman whose voice always held a hint of sadness, even when she smiled. As a child, I often asked about my father, but she would always evade the question, offering only vague phrases. "Your father loved you, Ethan, but he couldn't be here. That's all," she'd say. As a child, I accepted this explanation, but as I grew older, that mystery began to feel like an unhealing wound. When I turned 10, my mother remarried. That day, Colton Brigg entered our lives. He owned a junkyard on the outskirts of town, repairing old trucks and dismantling them for parts. He was the kind of man who wore grease-stained shirts even to church, and whose tone made people either shrink back or fall silent. At first, I hoped he could be the father I so desperately lacked. I yearned for someone to teach me how to throw a baseball or explain how the world worked. But Colton never looked at me with that kind of warmth. Within the first week of the wedding, he started calling me boy. Not Ethan, not son, just boy. At the dinner table, he'd ask, "Boy, are your chores done?" When I got a B on a math test, he'd sneer, "Boy, you won't get far with grades like that." Every word he spoke cut deep. One day, I mustered the courage to ask, "Could you just call me Ethan?" He put down his fork, fixed me with a steely gaze, and retorted, "A name has to be earned in my house. Until then, you're just a boy." My mother sat silently, staring at her plate. That silence became our life. Living with Colton was like walking a tightrope. If I did well in school, he'd find something to criticize. If I tried to keep my distance, he'd accuse me of laziness. He constantly berated me for being careless and lacking diligence. Pockets of peace emerged only when my mother, after he'd fallen asleep, would sit on the edge of my bed. She'd carefully tuck me in and quietly whisper words of encouragement. "You're much stronger than you think, Ethan. Just hold on." Those words were my anchor through countless nights. Yet even then, I couldn't help but notice the weariness etched on her face. She worked tirelessly at the grocery store to put food on the table, and her body bore the burden of trying to maintain a fragile peace in a home where harmony was a rare guest. By 15, a dream of escape had taken root within me. I believed that by working hard after school, I could save enough for a modest apartment. I took on odd jobs, mowing lawns, helping elderly neighbors with groceries, and stocking shelves at the local store. I gave half my earnings to my mother, but Colton invariably claimed it wasn't enough. He insisted I drop out of school and work full-time at his junkyard. "What good is algebra when there's real work to be done?" he once roared. I argued that I wanted to finish high school and maybe even go to college. His face contorted with anger, and he declared my dreams a waste of time. The tension in the house grew daily. Colton's animosity toward me was like an approaching storm cloud that never dissipated. He would slam the door when I came home, mutter insults under his breath, and never missed an opportunity to tell anyone who would listen that I was just another mouth to feed. Neighbors sympathized with me, but no one dared openly confront him. I lived with the constant awareness that my presence in that house was temporary and dependent on his mood. Sometimes, I tried to earn recognition and a sense of belonging. Once, I brought home an essay I'd written for English class. The teacher had marked it with red ink, "Excellent work," and I was filled with pride. I showed it to my mother in the kitchen, and for a moment, her face lit up with joy. But before she could say anything, Colton snatched the paper from my hands. He glanced at the first line, sneered, and tossed it into the trash. "Words don't feed you," he said indifferently. I wanted to scream, to demand that he see more in me than he imagined, but the words caught in my throat. Such was my life until that fateful night he kicked me out. I was a young man desperately trying to find my identity in a place that refused to acknowledge my existence. I held on to timid dreams and clung to my mother's words of support. But deep down, I knew Colton was just waiting for the right moment to get rid of me. Looking back, I realized those years hardened my character. They taught me to work, to survive without attachment, and to rely solely on my own strength. But at the time, it felt like a slow destruction of who I was meant to be. I was treated not as a son, but as an unwelcome guest in my own home, tolerated only because of the love of the woman who gave me life. This harsh introduction to adulthood shaped all my subsequent decisions and actions. By 16, I faced a choice: either stay and completely dissolve under Colton's control, or resist and face the inevitable consequences. I didn't know it then, but the moment of resistance was rapidly approaching. It would strip away what little security I still had, but at the same time, it would set the stage for everything that was to come. The turning point came that summer, after my 16th birthday. School had just ended, and while most of my peers discussed summer jobs and planned trips to the lake, my reality was entirely different. Colton had made it clear he expected me to work full-time at his junkyard. For him, summer wasn't a time for relaxation, but a season when business thrived, when men toiled in the scorching sun, disassembling parts and welding frames. One evening, looking at me across the dinner table, he declared, "Starting Monday, you belong to me from dawn till dusk." I tried to resist in the only way I knew how. "I want to keep working at the store," I told him. "I need to save money for school supplies and maybe college applications." He slammed his fist on the table so hard the dishes rattled. "College? Don't make me laugh. You're not cut out for that. You'll either break your back doing real work or you'll be a bum." My mother dropped her gaze, her fork suspended in midair. I wanted her to defend me, but I also knew her fear of him was stronger than her voice. Colton's outburst of rage was far louder than a teenager's plea. The conflict didn't end there. For several days, my stepfather persistently repeated his demands, seizing every opportunity. "The gates open at 6:00 a.m. You need to be there by 5:30, he'd insist. Notes with urgent reminders about my new duties appeared on the refrigerator door. One day, he even showed up at the store where I worked and rudely chastised my boss for letting me waste time stocking shelves. I knew perfectly well what it meant to disobey Colton, But something inside me resisted. I couldn't let this man destroy the fragile hope still flickering in my heart. I wanted something more than hands perpetually stained with motor oil and angry shouts echoing in my head. The decisive scene unfolded one Thursday evening when the humid air was thick with the chirping of cicadas and the scent of gasoline from Colton's work clothes. I had just declared that I wouldn't be quitting school or my job at the store. My stepfather's face purpled, and he pointed to the door. "You think you have a choice? Not in my house. Either you work for me or you don't live here." My stomach dropped, but I stood my ground. "Then I don't live here." Colton's lips twisted into a semblance of a smirk, more like a snarl. Leaning so close I could smell whiskey on his breath, my stepfather uttered, "You're nothing to me. You're not my concern." Those words sounded like a death sentence. My mother, in tears, begged Colton to stop, but he grabbed my backpack from the corner, shoved it against my chest, and pushed me out the door. She tried to grab my arm, crying, "Colton, please, he's just a child." Pushing her aside, Colton closed the door. I turned back to my mother one last time. She whispered, "Forgive me, Ethan. Please, forgive me." I wanted to rush to her, to hug her, and never let go, but the door mercilessly slammed shut between us. Standing outside in the stifling night air, I held only a half-empty backpack and the locket my mother had once given me. In that tragic moment, my childhood came to an end. He spent his first night under an old railway bridge on the outskirts of town. The damp ground was bitingly cold, and every sound of passing cars made him flinch. Hunger gnawed at him, but the feeling of loneliness was the strongest. Colton's words echoed continuously in his mind, each repetition hurting more than the last. "You're nothing to me. You're not my concern." If even his mother couldn't protect him, who could? The following weeks became a brutal struggle for survival. Ethan quickly learned where the nearest grocery store threw out expired bread, where a kind gas station attendant might offer a sandwich in exchange for cleaning up, and which churches left their doors open during the day for a rest on a back pew. He clung to his store job as long as possible, but without a fixed address, it became untenable. People started looking at him with suspicion when he arrived in wrinkled clothes. The store owner, trying to be delicate, eventually said, "Ethan, you can't keep coming in like this. Customers are complaining." The young man left with his last paycheck and no idea where to go. At night, he joined other displaced teenagers, just like himself. Some were runaways, others had lost parents to addiction, and some simply had nowhere else to go. They shared meager scraps of food and told sad stories of families who had betrayed them. One boy admitted his father kicked him out after catching him stealing. Another girl recounted how her stepmother locked her out one night and never let her back in. For the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't alone in carrying such a deep emotional wound, but this discovery did nothing to alleviate his pain. Each day became an exhausting search for food and a safe place to sleep where he wouldn't be robbed or beaten, as well as a desperate fight against the voice in his head that told him he was worthless. Ethan constantly wore the locket his mother had given him in his pocket, clutching it tightly in his hand when despair threatened to consume him. He told himself that if his mother couldn't save him, he would survive, living to see another day. Bitterness towards his biological father grew in Ethan's heart like an unquenchable fire. Why wasn't he there? Why had he left him to be raised by a man who hated him? Each unanswered question fueled his anger, and that anger gave him the strength to keep going. At 16, wandering alleys and sleeping under bridges, Ethan refused to break. He didn't yet know that these sufferings were just the beginning, and that the truth about his father and about who he truly was awaited him. By his 30th birthday, the protagonist had endured a kaleidoscope of events he couldn't have dreamed of as a young resident of Ohio. The years of wandering, from 16 to 30, had forged him into a hardened individual, teaching him to survive in a world that seemed to deliberately ignore his existence. He traveled from city to city, hitchhiking or walking, always seeking stable work. He toiled on farms during harvest, cleaned motel rooms when cheap labor was needed, and even collected bottles for months to exchange them for meager coins. In winter, death seemed to breathe down his neck as the cold pierced to his bones, making him doubt if he would ever feel warmth again. Stability remained an elusive dream. The closest he came to it was working in a diner in Kentucky. It was an unassuming brick building off a country road, a favorite spot for truckers stopping for coffee and eggs at dawn, and families filling the booths on Sundays after church. He was the dishwasher, confined to the back with a mountain of dirty plates, surrounded by the pervasive scent of soap and grease. His wages barely covered the rent for a tiny room above a hardware store, but it was more than he'd had in years. There was a strange comfort in this routine. He'd arrive at work at 6 in the morning, toil until the evening rush subsided, and then drag himself home. His hands were cracked from the hot water, his back ached from constant standing, but he told himself that at least he wasn't on the streets anymore. He had a bed, 4 walls, and enough food to quell the hunger that had haunted his teenage years. Still, deep down he felt invisible. People walked past him without noticing, and the only conversations he had were brief exchanges with the waitresses bringing in dirty dishes. One late autumn evening, with the crisp scent of approaching winter in the air, everything changed. He was scraping food remnants off plates in the back sink when the bell above the front door jingled. At first, the sound barely registered, but a few moments later, he heard his name. "Excuse me, does an Ethan Ward work here?" The voice was level, confident, and authoritative. He froze. No one ever looked for him. No one even knew his name, except for the manager who signed his paychecks. He emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. A man in his 50s stood at the counter, tall, with neatly slicked back graying hair and discerning eyes that scanned the room as if trained to notice every detail. He wore a dark coat and carried a leather briefcase under his arm. "That's me," he said cautiously. "I'm Ethan." The man nodded slightly. "My name is Silas Crane. I've been looking for you for 14 years. Silence fell over the diner. The waitresses exchanged bewildered glances, and one customer set down his coffee cup, staring at them. Ethan felt his heart clench. No one ever looked for people like him. "Why?" he asked, barely suppressing a tremor in his voice. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, carefully sealed envelope. He placed it on the counter and slid it towards Ethan. "Your father left instructions. He wanted you to be found, no matter how long it took." The room seemed to tilt. His legs weakened, and he gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. "My father?" he repeated. "I don't even know who he was." Silas's gaze softened. "That's about to change." Ethan stared at the envelope. For years, he had cursed the man who abandoned him. He imagined him as a coward who left his mother and him to fend for themselves, a ghost who cared so little he never once appeared in his life. And now, a stranger stood before him, claiming his father had left him something. Fear and anger wrestled within him. Part of him wanted to tear the envelope to shreds immediately. Another part wanted to throw it in the trash and walk away. He had survived without a father for 30 years. Why should it matter now? But curiosity proved stronger. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. The weight of the paper felt heavier than anything he had ever held. "Why now?" he asked. "Why after all these years?" Silas replied, "Because he knew time mattered, because he knew the truth would only make sense once you had lived enough to understand it." Ethan didn't understand what he meant. Silas's words hung in the air like smoke, confusing yet impossible to ignore. Glancing again at the envelope, addressed to him in an unfamiliar yet seemingly destined handwriting, he hesitated to open it in public. The letter stirred old wounds and raised questions he had painstakingly avoided. Who was his real father? Why had he vanished from his life? And what secret was hidden in this message that had waited 14 long years for its moment? In the quiet of his humble room, the envelope lay on the table like a ticking time bomb. He hesitated for a long time before breaking its seal, sensing that its contents would turn his world upside down. Everything he knew about himself, his identity, even the anger that had fueled him, could change forever after reading the truth. Finally, with a trembling hand, he opened the envelope, anticipating the revelation. Inside was a thick stack of papers with a bank statement on top. At first, the numbers seemed like a meaningless jumble of symbols, but then his gaze fixed on the balance, $73 million. He couldn't believe his eyes, rereading the figure again and again. How could a man who abandoned him leave such a fortune, and why was the money in his name? Beneath the statement lay a handwritten letter on yellowed paper. Ethan, it began. He forced himself to breathe, delving into the lines penned by the man who had given him life. My son, I know you will read this letter when I am no longer here. I don't know what kind of man you've become, but know that I have always carried you in my heart. If you are reading this, then it is time for you to know the truth. He pressed the letter to his chest, connecting with his father's words for the first time. The letter unveiled the past's secret. When you were born, my life was full of dangers. My name is Jonathan Hale. I built a successful business, but with success came enemies. When your mother became pregnant, we started receiving threats. Even those I trusted betrayed me. I realized that anyone connected to me was in danger. To protect you, I made the hardest decision of my life: to leave. I provided your mother with everything she needed, but I couldn't stay close without putting you both at risk. Ethan's heart ached. For years he had thought his father a coward, but now he learned that he had sacrificed himself for his safety. Every word of the letter grew heavier. I made sure money was set aside in a trust fund to provide you with a future I couldn't personally give. I asked Silas Crane, a man I trusted, to find you when the time was right. If you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer here, but I hope you understand why I had to remain in the shadows. Tears blurred his eyes, but he continued to read every word. I never stopped loving you, Ethan. Every day I thought of you. Every decision I made was dictated by concern for your safety. Forgive me for having to grow up without me, but I pray that you understand I acted out of love. You weren't abandoned. You were protected. He put down the letter and covered his face with his hands. His entire life, he had lived with a feeling of being unwanted, considering himself a burden. But now, in his hands, was proof of a father's love so strong that he had given up everything. The money seemed insignificant compared to the words echoing in his head. You weren't abandoned, you were protected. The figure of $73 million paled before the realization that he was loved and protected by a father who had sacrificed his own happiness for his safety. The realization that I hadn't been abandoned thundered through my consciousness after reading my father's letter. You were protected, the words echoed, making me recall the old locket in my backpack that I had kept for years as a link to the past. It turned out to be not just an artifact, but a symbol of my mother's love, as hidden as my own pain. In that moment, two loves, my mother's fragile love and my father's distant protective love, merged in my heart. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry without restraint. All the hardships of life under bridges, the hunger, the anger at the man I thought was a betrayer, burst forth like a raging river, sweeping everything in its path. The pain in my chest was unbearable, but within it, I felt something new: liberation. Hours later, when the tears subsided, I reread the letter again and again. Every word seared itself into my memory, changing my perception of myself. I realized that despite Colton's rejection and my mother's fear, my real father had always carried me in his heart, even from a distance. I remembered Silas, his calm demeanor and patience in the diner, his words about searching for 14 years. Now I understood the burden he carried, keeping this secret until the right moment. Jonathan Hale had entrusted him with the most important thing in his life, and Silas had fulfilled his duty. My gaze fell upon the bank statement: $73 million. The sum seemed unfathomable. I remembered myself as a 16-year-old, shivering under a bridge, clutching the locket and dreaming of a better life. I recalled the sleepless nights spent hungry, the countless odd jobs just to survive. And now, all that suffering coexisted with wealth I couldn't have even dreamed of. Joy would have been too simple an explanation for my feelings. In truth, I felt bitterness for the lost years, anger at my mother for concealing the truth, and confusion about a future with such an inheritance. But above all, I felt something I had long forgotten: hope. My father's letter gave me back my name. I was no longer the boy, a burden, or a mistake. I was Ethan Ward, son of Jonathan Hale, a man who sacrificed his present for my protection, a man whose love spanned decades. That evening, folding the letter and carefully placing it back in the envelope, I whispered in the quiet room, "I forgive you, Father. Thank you for never forgetting me." The realization that I hadn't been abandoned filled me not only with joy, but also with sadness for the lost years. This news turned my life upside down, forcing me to reevaluate the past and look to the future with hope. In the following days, Silas Crane remained by my side, patiently explaining the details of managing the inheritance. He emphasized the responsibility that came with the wealth. "Your father wanted you to have freedom," Silas said, "but he also wanted you to be wise. He believed that years of hardship would give you an understanding that money couldn't buy." I nodded, trying to comprehend everything. Memories of hungry nights and humiliating pleas for help resurfaced, and now I was being told I had everything I needed to never want again. However, I understood that money was merely a means, not an end. The main lesson lay in resilience, survival, and the realization that love can manifest in different forms. My father's love was distant but resolute. My mother's love was broken but sincere. And even my own self-love, hidden beneath layers of shame, had helped me endure. My first priority was to visit my mother, with whom I hadn't spoken in years, harboring resentment for her failure to protect me from Colton. When she saw me at the door of her modest apartment, she gasped as if seeing a ghost. Her graying hair and trembling hands betrayed her age. "Ethan," she whispered, "I thought I'd lost you forever." Holding back my own tears, I replied, "You never lost me, Mom. I just needed time to understand." She broke down, repeating her apologies. "After Colton left, I was so ashamed. I looked for you year after year, but then I decided you'd be better off without a mother who had failed you. I thought I didn't deserve to find you." I told my mother I forgave her, opening up about the truth contained in my father's letter. Her eyes reflected both sadness and relief. In that moment, I felt like her son again, as if returning to childhood. Forgiveness brought me peace, but I realized I couldn't stop there. I remembered the children I had met on the streets, those who shared meager scraps of food with me, and those who vanished without a trace, swallowed by a merciless system that had forgotten them. The image of my younger self, cold and trembling, with a question in his eyes about whether life would ever get better, resurfaced. I understood that I couldn't change the past, but I could change the future for others. I then decided to use part of my inheritance to establish a foundation to help homeless youth. Shelters were organized where those in need could find warm beds and hot meals. Counseling, vocational training, and the kind of support I had so desperately needed at 16 were provided. I frequently visited the shelters, talked with the children, and listened intently to their stories. Some looked at me with distrust when I spoke of my past. "You're so different now," one boy remarked. I smiled and replied, "One day you will be different too. Don't give up. You are remembered." Each time I left a shelter, I felt a sense of purpose that no money could buy. My father had left me not only wealth, but also the opportunity to turn my pain into a source of good. I continued to work, though not as a dishwasher. I found meaning in speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, sharing my story with others so they could understand what it means to lose everything and keep moving forward. People listened intently because they saw that I had lived through it, that every word came from the depths of my soul. Looking back at that boy with a backpack, standing homeless outside his house, I would want to tell him what I know now. Hold on. The pain is real, but it's not forever. You are stronger than you think, and your life has a purpose you cannot yet see. That night, when my stepfather kicked me out, it felt like the end of my life story. But in reality, it was just beginning. I learned a simple but profound truth. Sometimes we are broken so we can become stronger. Sometimes we are cast aside so we can learn to stand on our own. And sometimes we are hidden because the world isn't ready for who we are meant to become. Now, anger no longer fuels me. Gratitude guides me. Gratitude for my father's sacrifice, for my mother's fragile love, for Silas's loyalty, and for my own refusal to give up. And to you, listening to my story, I want to convey this. No matter how forgotten you feel or how cruel the world may seem, you are not insignificant, you are not hopeless, and your story is not over.